Patricia sat in the darkness of Grandma Salami's basement, her pink dress pooling around her like spilled juice on the concrete floor. The basement was cold. It smelled like old wood and forgotten things, cardboard boxes stacked in corners, jars of pickled vegetables nobody ate anymore, and the metal smell of tools hanging on pegs. She held her grandmother's phone in both hands, her thumbs shaking. Through the thin wooden slats of the basement ceiling, she could see the living room above. Not clearly. Just shadows. Just boots. The boots had started arriving 10 minutes ago. Grandma Salome had whispered the plan to her when they heard the first car pull up outside. Basement. Fast. Your phone. Send the texts. Don't make a sound. Patricia had memorized the phone number Grandma made her write down weeks ago. A number Grandma said to use only if the wrong kind of men came knocking. The wrong kind of men were here. Patricia counted the shadows as they moved across the floorboards. 1, 2, 3. She pressed her eye against the gap between the wooden slats, trying to see better. The boots were expensive. Black leather, polished so shiny she could almost see her reflection in them from here. These weren't regular robbers. Grandma had been right about that. More boots came down the hallway. 4, 5, 6. Patricia's fingers moved quickly on the phone screen, typing the way Grandma had taught her. Fast, no mistakes, no emojis, just numbers and facts. 6 boots. Black leather. Moving toward kitchen. She hit send and waited. The reply came 3 seconds later. Not words. Just a thumbs-up emoji. Patricia allowed herself one small breath. Above, she heard a man's voice. It was deep and mean, like a dog that hadn't eaten in days. The old woman's in here somewhere, he said. And the girl. Find them. Patricia squeezed the phone tighter. She thought about Grandma Salome upstairs, pretending to be alone in the living room. Grandma was brave like that. Grandma said that staying calm when you were scared was the most important superpower anyone could have. 2 more shadows passed across the basement ceiling. Patricia watched them move through the kitchen. Then the hallway. Then the bedroom. 2 more. Total 8 now. Checking bedrooms. She sent the message, and again, the thumbs up came back fast. Patricia shifted her weight. Her legs were starting to hurt from sitting on the cold concrete. She could hear footsteps above, heavy and loud, like giants walking through Grandma's house. They were opening drawers, slamming doors. Once something crashed, a lamp maybe, or a picture frame. Her heart beat so hard she thought it might be loud enough for them to hear through the floor. She looked back through the slats. More boots. These ones were different. Smaller. Faster. Someone new had arrived. New person. 3 boots total now outside house. White truck parked on corner. Lights off. The thumbs up came back, but this time it took 5 seconds instead of 3. Patricia wondered if that meant something. If that meant Min-jae was thinking harder now. Planning. The mean dog voice came again from upstairs. Check the basement door. Patricia's breath stopped in her chest. She could hear them walking toward the basement stairs. Heavy footsteps. More than one person. They were coming down. But then another voice shouted from outside. A new voice. Cold. Not angry, just cold. Like winter. Like metal. Step away from the door, the cold voice said. Now. Everything went quiet. Patricia watched the shadows on the ceiling shift. The boots that had been moving toward the basement steps suddenly stopped. Through the slat, she could see them turning, moving back toward the front of the house. Her thumb hovered over the phone keyboard. She didn't know what to type. She didn't know what was happening. Then her phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. An actual call. The name on the screen made her eyes go wide. Dad. No. Not her dad. The name that Grandma Salome had told her to trust. The name that meant everything was going to be okay now. Kang Min-jae. Patricia answered the phone. She didn't speak. She just listened to his breathing on the other end, steady and calm, like someone who had done this before. Like someone who was never afraid. Keep watching, he said. His voice wasn't cold anymore. It was just quiet. Tell me everything you see. Patricia looked back through the slats. The boots were moving again. But this time they were running. Okay, she whispered into the phone. Okay, I'm watching. And she was. From her spot in the darkness of the basement, in her pink dress and bare feet, Patricia Park became the eyes that Min-jae needed to see. She became his advantage. The white t-shirt was the first thing the neighbors would notice if they were looking out their windows. But they weren't. Min-jae had made sure of that. A car parked at the end of the block, engine running, radio loud. A small accident 2 streets over, just enough to pull attention away. In this business, silence wasn't about not making noise. It was about making the right kind of noise in the wrong place. Min-jae stepped out of the lead SUV, his shirt pristine and white against the dying light of the suburban street. The neighborhood was the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Quiet driveways, garden gnomes, a basketball hoop with a flat tire in someone's yard. The vulture had chosen Salami's house because he thought it was invisible. Safe. He was wrong. Lee Sang-ho was already in position, crouched behind the oak tree near the mailbox. He'd been waiting for 12 minutes, watching the house with the patience of a man who had learned to hold his breath for longer than most people could stay awake. When he saw Min-jae, he didn't wave, didn't nod, just made 2 quick hand signals. 6 inside, 2 on lookout on the eastern side of the property. Min-jae moved forward with his hands loose at his sides, not reaching for anything, not threatening anything, just walking like a man who had every right to be here. That was the art of it, moving through the world like you owned it, even when you were about to take it apart. 2 more guards peeled off from the shadows of the neighboring yards. Park Jin-soo and Choi Tae-oh. They didn't acknowledge Min-jae either. They just took their positions. One moved toward the back fence, staying low, staying quiet. The other circled around to the side of the house where the basement window sat half-hidden behind overgrown bushes. The phone in Min-jae's pocket buzzed. A text from Patricia. 4 of them near back door now. 2 still in front room with grandma. Min-jae's jaw tightened slightly. For near the back meant the perimeter was thinner at the front. For near the back also meant they were searching the house room by room, getting desperate. The vulture wanted something. The old woman had something. And Min-jae was running out of time. Lee Sang-ho appeared at his side, moving like smoke. The back door is locked from inside, Lee whispered, his voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air. Windows on the west side are wired. Looks like the old woman was prepared for trouble. Of course she was. Salome wasn't just any old woman. Min-jae thought about the pocket watch sitting in Patricia's hands. About the man who used to own it. About the night 40 years ago when a starving boy had been given soup and a place to sleep without questions. The basement, Min-jae said. That's where the girl is? Lee nodded. Text came from the phone at 7:43. She's been sending updates every 3 minutes. Smart kid. Not panicking. Counting heads like she's doing inventory. Min-jae felt something shift in his chest. Something cold became something else. Not warm exactly. Just different. Patricia was 8 years old, sitting in a basement, texting the most dangerous man in the city like she was calling in a pizza order. That took a kind of courage most adults never developed. When I go in the front, Min-jae said, the guards on the east side move to the back. The moment I have their attention, you unlock the basement window from outside. Silent. The girl needs an exit. And the old woman? Lee asked. The old woman, Min-jae said, is the reason they're here. She stays until we know what they want. Lee melted back into the shadows without another word. Min-jae checked his watch. 7:51 p.m. 9 minutes had passed since the first text. In 9 minutes, the vulture would start getting impatient. In 9 minutes, desperate men started doing stupid things. Min-jae straightened his white t-shirt. He was about to walk into a house where 6 armed men were looking for a vulnerable old woman and a scared child. He was about to walk in alone, without a visible weapon, without backup close enough to see him. But he wasn't afraid. Fear was for people who didn't understand that sometimes being cold was the only thing that kept you alive. Another buzz. Patricia's text. Man just raised his hand to hit grandma. Min-jae. He's going to hit her. Min-jae's white t-shirt was still pristine. But that was about to change. He walked toward the front door of Salami's house like a man who already owned every room inside it. Behind him, his guards moved like ghosts through the suburban darkness, taking their positions. Lee Sang-ho had his hand on the basement window latch, waiting for the signal. Everything was in place. Everything was about to explode. Min-jae reached for the front door handle, and his fingers closed around cold metal. He could hear them inside now. The mean voice. Salami's calm response. And beneath it all, the silence of a little girl in a pink dress, watching through basement slats, ready to do her part. He turned the handle and stepped inside. Choi Dong-hyun had earned his nickname long before he decided to use it. The vulture circled. The vulture waited. The vulture picked clean whatever bones were left behind. He stood in Salami's living room with his hands in his pockets, looking at the old woman like she was a problem he'd already solved. "You know what I find funny?" Choi said. His voice wasn't loud. That was the thing about truly dangerous men. They never had to shout. A woman your age, pretending to be brave. It's almost cute. Salome sat in her armchair, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the same cardigan she'd been wearing since 7 in the morning. Gray wool. Small buttons. The kind of thing a grandmother wore to garden or watch television, not to face 6 armed men searching her home. "I'm not pretending," Salome said quietly. "I'm just sitting." Choi laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had never heard the word no and didn't plan to start now. He was younger than Salome by 40 years, but he moved with the confidence of a man who believed age meant weakness. His suit was expensive. His watch was expensive. His shoes left marks on Salome's hardwood floor that she would have to clean up later, if there was a later. "Where is she?" Choi asked. "The girl. Patricia, right? Pretty name. Where is she hiding?" Salome didn't answer. She just looked at her hands. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, but they were steady. No trembling. No fear showing on her face, even though fear was the only logical response to 6 men turning your home into a hunting ground. Choi stepped closer to her chair. One of his men, a younger one with a scar on his neck, moved to stand behind Salome. The message was clear. Nowhere to run. No point trying. "The ledger," Choi said. "The notebook. The thing your dead husband kept all those years. That's what we're looking for. Where is it?" Salome looked up at him. Her eyes were gray like winter. "I don't have what you're looking for." "You're lying," Choi said simply. He raised his hand, and the scarred man flinched, ready for the signal. This was the moment. This was when the old woman would break. This was when she would tell him everything, because that's what people did when they were faced with real consequences. But Salome didn't break. "You can hit me," she said, and her voice didn't waver. "But it won't change the answer. I don't have it." Choi's hand hung in the air for a moment. Not because he was hesitating, because he was deciding. In that space between heartbeats, in that frozen instant where one choice would lead to blood and the other to questions, Choi Dong-hyun made his decision. He was about to swing when the front door opened. It wasn't violent. There was no crash, no explosion of wood and metal. The door just opened like someone had turned the handle and walked inside. Like they belonged there. Like they owned the space. Kang Min-jae stepped into Salome's living room wearing a white t-shirt and an expression of absolute calm. Choi's arm dropped. His eyes narrowed. "You." Me, Min-jae agreed. He didn't reach for anything. His hands stayed at his sides. He just stood there in the doorway, looking at the vulture with the kind of cold that made the room temperature drop. Salome's hands remained folded in her lap, but something changed in her eyes. Recognition. Relief. Not because she was afraid of this young man, but because she knew what he meant. She knew why he was here. She started counting in her head. How long until the back door opened? How long until Lee Sang-ho's careful hands unlocked the basement window? How long until Patricia could climb out into the suburban darkness and run? "This is not your business," Choi said to Min-jae. But his voice had changed. It had lost some of its confidence. "It became my business when you walked into this house," Min-jae replied. Choi's men shifted their weight. They looked to their leader for a signal. The scarred one behind Salome's chair took a step back. Uncertainty was spreading through them like a virus. Salome watched the clock on her mantel. 7:54 p.m. She had been counting for 14 minutes. 14 minutes since Patricia sent the first text. 14 minutes since everything became inevitable. The vulture didn't know it yet, but he had already lost. He had walked into a nest that wasn't his, with claws that weren't sharp enough, against a man who had built his empire on understanding exactly how to take things apart. Salome waited in her armchair and continued to count the seconds until the vulture learned what it felt like to be hunted instead of hunting. The moment had arrived. Now it was just about what happened next. Min-jae didn't move fast. He didn't move slow either. He moved like a man who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. He closed the front door behind him softly, the click of the latch almost polite. Then he looked at each of the 6 men in the living room, one by one, eye to eye, and walked past them toward the kitchen. None of them tried to stop him. Choi Dong-hyun's hand went up again, but this time it wasn't to hit Salome. It was to stop his own men from moving. "What are you doing?" Choi called out, his voice sharp now, the false confidence cracking. Min-jae didn't answer. He had moved into the kitchen, and was running his fingers along the wooden chairs that sat tucked under Salami's dining table. The table was old. The kind of old that meant it had seen decades of meals. Holidays. Arguments. Birthdays. All the small moments that made a life. He pulled one of the chairs out. It scraped against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Then Min-jae turned it around backward and sat in it in the middle of the living room, his arms folded across the top of the chair's back, his chin resting on his forearms. He was looking directly at Choi Dong-hyun. The room had gone completely silent. Even the scarred man had stopped breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. Guns were easy. Guns made sense. But this, a man sitting in a chair like he was waiting for tea, this didn't make sense. "I'm going to tell you something," Min-jae said, his voice so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear it. "And you're going to listen because you already know it's true." Choi's jaw tightened. "I don't take orders in my own." "You're not in your own operation," Min-jae interrupted, still speaking like he was commenting on the weather. "You're in the home of someone who matters. Someone who has always mattered. And you walked in here thinking you understood the rules of the game." Min-jae shifted slightly, uncrossing his arms and letting one hand hang loose. Not reaching for anything, just letting it hang. "But the rules changed," he continued, "the moment you decided to threaten this house." One of Choi's men, the younger one on the left, shifted his weight nervously. His hand was near his jacket, near the gun he was carrying. But he didn't pull it. Something in Min-jae's stillness was more frightening than any movement could have been. "You came here looking for something," Min-jae said to Choi. "A ledger. A notebook. Information. Something that belonged to Salami's husband. Something that could hurt people." Salome sat perfectly still in her armchair, her cardigan gray and ordinary, her hands still folded in her lap. "Here's what you need to understand," Min-jae said. "That thing you're looking for? It doesn't matter anymore. It stopped matching the day the man who wrote it died. All the names in it, all the favors, all the leverage, none of that belongs to you. None of it ever will." Choi took a step toward Min-jae, his face flushed now with anger and confusion. "You think you're going to come into my operation and tell me?" "This isn't your operation," Min-jae said calmly. "And this isn't your decision to make." The moment hung in the air like something physical. All 6 of Choi's men were waiting for his signal. Waiting for him to order them forward. Waiting for the violence to start. But Choi was frozen, caught between pride and the terrible realization that he had made a mistake. Min-jae stood up from the chair slowly. He turned it around and pushed it back under the table with the same care someone would use to tuck a child into bed. "You have 3 minutes," Min-jae said, "to take your men and leave this house. You have 3 minutes to walk out the same way you walked in, and then we never speak about this again. You don't come back. You don't send anyone else. You forget this house exists. And if I don't..." Choi's voice was smaller now, weaker. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. His white t-shirt was still pristine. His hands were still empty. He hadn't raised his voice or pulled a weapon. He had just sat in a chair and spoken truth, and somehow that had been enough to shift the entire balance of the room. "Then you'll find out," Min-jae said quietly, "why they call me what they call me." Choi Dong-hyun, the vulture, took a step backward. Then another. His men followed, reading the signal in his movement even though no order had been given. 3 minutes later, the front door of Salami's house closed behind them. The silence that remained was different. Softer. Like the breathing of people who had just survived something they didn't fully understand. Min-jae looked at Salome, and for the first time since he'd entered the house, something other than cold calculation crossed his face. Recognition. And beneath it, something older. Something he thought he'd buried decades ago. Memory. The front door had barely closed when Salome stood up from her armchair. Not slowly. Not like an old woman struggling to rise. She stood up like someone who had been waiting for permission, and now that permission had been granted, there was work to do. Min-jae watched her move into the kitchen. He didn't follow her immediately. He just stood in the living room, still wearing that expression of controlled calm, but something underneath it had shifted. Something was waiting to surface. "Tea," Salome called from the kitchen. "No," Min-jae said. "I'm making it anyway," Salome replied. Min-jae found himself walking toward the kitchen, toward the sound of her voice, toward the thing he thought he'd left behind 40 years ago. The kitchen was warm. There was a kettle on the stove, and Salome was pulling down 2 cups from a cabinet that had probably held those same cups for decades. She moved with purpose. Not the slow, careful movements of age, but the quick efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. "You're wondering why I'm not grateful," Salome said without looking at him. "Why I'm not thanking you for saving us." "No," Min-jae said. "I'm wondering why you're not surprised that I came." Salome smiled. It was the kind of smile that held 1,000 conversations, 1,000 moments, 1,000 small mercies that added up to something like love. "Because I sent the message through Patricia," Salome said. "I sent that picture of the watch because I knew you would recognize it. I knew you would come. I've always known you would come if I called." The kettle began to whistle. "You knew who I was," Min-jae said. "It wasn't a question." "I've always known who you were," Salome replied, pouring water into the cups. Steam rose up between them like a barrier that wasn't really a barrier at all. A hungry boy became a man who built an empire. The details changed. The person didn't. She handed him a cup. He took it without thinking. The warmth of it spread through his palms. For a moment, he was 8 years old again, cold and afraid, and this woman was handing him soup. "Choi Dong-hyun didn't come here for me," Salome said, settling into a chair at the small kitchen table. She gestured for Min-jae to sit across from her. "He came here for the ledger. My husband's ledger. The notebook where he wrote down every favor, every debt, every secret that held this city together." Min-jae sat. He was holding a cup of tea in the kitchen of the woman who had fed him decades ago, and she was about to tell him why the vulture had been clawing at her home. "My husband is dead," Salome continued. 10 years now. But before he died, he gave me that ledger. He said, 'Salome, keep this safe. Keep this hidden. The day someone comes looking for it is the day you call that hungry boy. You remember him? You call him.' He knew I would become. He knew you would become what you needed to become to survive," Salome interrupted gently. "He was a good man, but he wasn't blind. He understood the world. He understood that you had gifts. Dangerous gifts, but gifts nonetheless." Min-jae set down his tea carefully. "The ledger. Choi's backers. Tell me." Salome reached behind her and pulled out a small wooden box from beneath the sink. Inside it, wrapped in old plastic, was a leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was neat, organized. Every entry a web of connection. "Choi Dong-hyun works for Park Min-sung," Salome said, opening the notebook to a specific page. "Park Min-sung answers to Lee Ju-won. Lee Ju-won's money comes from the councilman's office, the one that just started pushing for new development in the Port District." She pointed to the names written in her husband's careful script. Each one was a thread in a much larger tapestry. "Choi wasn't looking for revenge," Salome said. "He was looking for leverage. The ledger contains information about every corrupt official, every crime boss, every deal that keeps this city running. If Choi had given that information to his backers, they would have controlled everyone. They would have owned the whole city." Min-jae's eyes moved across the page. Names he knew. Faces he'd avoided. Powers he'd kept at a distance because going against them seemed impossible. "They sent Choi here because they thought an old woman alone wouldn't have protection," Salome said quietly. "They didn't know about you. They didn't know that when they threatened this house, they were threatening the one place on this earth that could bring you back." "You used Patricia," Min-jae said. Not angry. Just stating fact. "I kept Patricia safe," Salome corrected. "There's a difference. She was never in danger because you were always coming. And now you're here, and now you know what your real enemies look like." Min-jae looked at the ledger. At his past. At the map of a city that was about to change. "Information really is deadlier than lead," he said quietly. "It always has been," Salome replied. "My husband knew that. That's why he left it to me. And now I'm giving it to you." She slid the ledger across the table. "What you do with it," Salome said, "is your choice. But you're not a hungry boy anymore. You're a man who can change things. So change them." Min-jae picked up the ledger, and something inside him shifted. The cold that had kept him alive for 40 years began to warm. Just slightly. Just enough to remember what it felt like to matter to someone. Patricia hadn't moved from her spot on the basement floor. The phone in her hands had gone quiet. No more texts from Min-jae. No more instructions. Just silence, which meant one of two things. Either everything was fine, or everything was about to change. She pressed her ear against the basement slats and listened. The voices had moved. The mean dog voice, Choi's voice, was no longer in the living room. Neither were most of his men. Footsteps upstairs told her they were leaving, going back to their cars, getting ready to disappear. But something didn't feel right. Patricia had always been good at knowing when something didn't feel right. It was a gift, Grandma Salome said. An instinct. The ability to read the spaces between words and understand what wasn't being said. 3 of Choi's men were still in the house. She could hear them moving through the hallway, getting frustrated, tearing through drawers. One of them had knocked over a lamp. The crash had echoed down through the floorboards 20 minutes ago. They were still looking for something. Still searching even though their boss seemed to be leaving. The basement window opened. It was so quiet that Patricia almost missed it. But she heard the soft scrape of the latch, the careful lifting of the pane. Lee Sang-ho's face appeared in the small window, partially hidden by the overgrown bushes that blocked the view from the street. He didn't speak, didn't make any sound. He just looked at Patricia and made a gesture with his hand, 2 fingers pointing down, then up, then down again. A signal. Patricia understood. Min-jae was making his move. Now. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. She grabbed the flashlight she'd been holding since they first heard the cars arrive. It was old, the kind Grandma kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies. The beam was bright and yellow and strong. Patricia moved to the basement vent, the one that ran along the ceiling and connected to the hallway above. The slats were metal, angled so air could flow through, but you couldn't see down easily. Unless you knew the angle. Unless you understood light and reflection the way Patricia did. She'd studied physics at school. Grandma had a book about kinetic energy and light patterns. Patricia had read it 3 times. The footsteps upstairs moved closer to the vent. 3 men. Frustrated. Angry. One of them was pulling open closet doors now, the sound of hangers scraping against metal rods. Patricia raised the flashlight. Upstairs, Lee Sang-ho appeared in the basement window frame, and through the reflection in his eyes, Patricia saw the signal. Not with her hands, but with his. Just a nod. Now. Patricia aimed the flashlight at the vent and switched it on. The beam shot up through the metal slats and hit the ceiling at exactly the angle she'd calculated. The light bounced off the white plaster and came back down right into the eyes of the guard closest to the vent. Bright. Blinding. Completely unexpected. The man shouted and threw his hands up to shield his face. That was the moment Min-jae needed. Patricia couldn't see him from her position in the basement, but she heard the result. A sound like something heavy hitting something soft. A grunt. Footsteps scrambling backward. The other 2 guards yelling, confused about what had just happened. The light was still blinding them. Patricia kept the beam steady, even though her arms were starting to shake. She understood now why Grandma wanted her to stay calm. Why staying calm mattered. Because panic made hands shake, and shaky hands meant the light moved, and moving light meant they could adapt. She kept it still. Another sound from upstairs. A body hitting the ground. Then movement, fast, controlled movement. Min-jae's movement. The kind of movement that looked like violence, but was really just strategy. Just mathematics. Just the application of advantage. The man she'd blinded with the flashlight was still covering his face. His eyes would need time to adjust. Time he didn't have. Min-jae used that time like a weapon. 30 seconds of chaos upstairs. Shouting. The sound of something breaking. Then silence. The basement window closed quietly. Lee Sang-ho's face was gone. The signal was complete. Patricia lowered the flashlight. Her hands were trembling now, and she let them tremble. The work was done. The moment had passed. She sat in the darkness of the basement, in her pink dress with dust on her cheeks, and she waited. She'd done her part. The eyes in the floorboards had seen everything that needed to be seen. The light from the basement had created the opening that needed to be created. Patricia was 8 years old, and she had just changed the course of a battle using nothing but physics and a steadily held beam of light. Upstairs, she heard footsteps. One set of footsteps, moving slowly through the house, coming toward the basement door. The door opened. Min-jae stood at the top of the stairs, his white t-shirt no longer pristine. There were marks on it now. Dark marks that told stories of struggle and victory. "You can come up now," he said to Patricia. His voice was different. Softer. Like someone who had just remembered how to speak gently. "Is it over?" Patricia asked. Min-jae looked at the girl in the pink dress, sitting in the basement with a flashlight, and he understood something fundamental about the world. Sometimes the most dangerous people weren't the ones who could fight the hardest. Sometimes they were the ones who understood that light could be a weapon too. "It's over," he said. "You can come home now." Patricia climbed the basement stairs carefully, her pink dress trailing behind her. The first floor of the house smelled wrong. Copper. Fear. The sharp smell of things that happened when people stopped thinking and started fighting. Min-jae stood in the hallway, waiting for her. Behind him, two of Choi's men lay very still on the living room floor. Very still in the way that meant they wouldn't be getting up. "We need to move you upstairs," Min-jae said. "Your grandmother is in the kitchen. You'll stay with her until this is over." "Until what's over?" Patricia asked. But she already knew the answer. She could hear the sirens in the distance. Police. Or maybe Choi's other men. In this city, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. Min-jae put his hand gently on her shoulder. It was the first time he'd really touched her. His palm was warm and steady. For a moment, the coldness in his eyes softened into something else. Something human. "Just stay inside," he said. "Keep the doors locked." Patricia nodded, but before she could move, the front window exploded. Glass scattered across the living room floor like shattered ice. A gunshot. Not from inside the house, but from outside. From the street. From people who didn't know Min-jae was in here. From people who had come to finish what Choi had started. Min-jae pushed Patricia toward the kitchen, but she didn't make it far. The second shot came through the side window, punching a hole in the drywall where Patricia would have been standing if Min-jae hadn't moved her. The bullet kept going, past her face, past her shoulder, close enough that she felt the air change around it. Salome appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wasn't afraid. She was just looking at Min-jae waiting, knowing what he had to do. "Lock the back door," Min-jae called to her. "Don't open it for anyone but Lee Sang-ho." Then he was moving. Fast. Toward the broken window. Toward the gunfire. Patricia grabbed his arm. "Wait." But Min-jae was already gone, rolling through the window frame with a movement so smooth it looked almost like dancing. Outside, she heard shouting. Then the sound of his guards moving into position. Then more gunshots. Patricia stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her small hands still reaching for the place where Min-jae had been. Salome came and pulled her into the kitchen, away from the windows. "Sit," Salome commanded gently, and Patricia sat. Through the kitchen window, she could see Min-jae in the front yard. His white t-shirt was visible against the darkness. A target. An obvious, terrible target. He moved like he didn't care about being a target. He moved like he'd made peace with the idea of dying a long time ago. One of the gunmen emerged from behind the neighbor's SUV. Min-jae saw him and moved left, toward the oak tree. A shot missed him by inches. He didn't slow down. He just kept moving, kept advancing, kept pushing the gunman back away from the house. Away from Patricia. That was the moment she understood. Min-jae wasn't fighting them. He was hurting them. Pushing them away from Salami's home the way a guard dog pushes wolves away from a flock. And he was using his body to do it. Using himself as the thing they aimed at instead of the house. Another shot. This one found him. Patricia saw it happen. She saw Min-jae's shoulder jerk backward. She saw him reach down, his hand coming back wet. His white t-shirt, pristine and clean just minutes before, was now stained dark red. He didn't stop moving. He didn't cry out or slow down or show pain. He just adjusted his angle slightly and kept advancing. Lee Sang-ho appeared from the other side of the yard, his own weapon raised, and together they pushed the gunman further back, toward their cars, away from the house. "Close your eyes," Salome said to Patricia, but Patricia didn't. She watched Min-jae bleed. She watched him take the damage, so the house wouldn't have to. So Patricia wouldn't have to. Within 2 minutes, the gunmen were retreating. Their cars started. They drove away into the night, leaving behind a man in a ruined white t-shirt, standing in a suburban yard like he'd just been born from the violence itself. Min-jae walked back to the house slowly. Each step seemed to cost him something. When he reached the front door, Lee Sang-ho was there, supporting his arm. "The medic is coming," Lee said. 5 minutes. Min-jae nodded. He looked at Patricia through the kitchen window, and for a moment, their eyes met across the space of the house. His shirt was torn and bloody. His face was pale. But his eyes were still that cold flint color. Except now there was something else in them too. A question. A wonder. A realization that some things, some debts, couldn't be paid with money or pride or distance. Some debts had to be paid with blood. Patricia understood that Min-jae had just paid one of those debts. Not because she'd asked him to. Not because he owed it to her. But because somewhere inside the cold machine of a man he'd become, there was still a part of him that remembered being a hungry boy. And that boy would always protect the things Salome loved. Always. The medic had finished bandaging Min-jae's shoulder an hour ago. The bullet had gone clean through, missing bone and major blood vessels by millimeters. Lucky, the medic had said. Min-jae didn't believe in luck. He believed in geometry and angles, and the fact that people who stayed calm under pressure survived things that killed other people. He sat at Salami's kitchen table in a borrowed shirt, the borrowed fabric loose on his frame. His blood-stained t-shirt sat in a plastic bag on the counter, evidence of a debt paid in full. Choi Dong-hyun stood across from him in handcuffs. Lee Sang-ho had brought him in an hour after the shooting stopped. The vulture had tried to run, had made it as far as the highway before Min-jae's people intercepted him. Now he stood in a suburban kitchen, still wearing his expensive suit, looking at a man who had dismantled his entire operation in a single evening. "You can't do this," Choi said. His voice had lost all its meanness. Now it was just desperate. "I have backers. Real backers. People who won't let you." "Sit down," Min-jae said quietly. Choi sat. Min-jae opened a folder on the table. Inside were documents. Legal documents. The kind with official stamps and lawyer signatures. The kind that meant something in courtrooms and boardrooms. 3 weeks ago, Min-jae began, "You took out a loan against this house. You wanted leverage. You wanted to threaten Salome with foreclosure if she didn't give you the ledger. You borrowed the money from the Harbor Development Bank." Choi's face went pale. "That bank," Min-jae continued, "was recently purchased. The entire portfolio of loans was transferred to new ownership. All of them, including yours." Min-jae slid a document across the table. A deed. A transfer of ownership. A name written at the bottom in neat script. "Kang Min-jae. I bought your debt," Min-jae said. "I own this house now. Legally. Officially. Which means you can't foreclose on it because I don't foreclose on myself." Choi's hands clenched into fists, the metal cuffs biting into his wrists. "That's not, you can't just." "I can," Min-jae said. "And I did. Your leverage is gone. Your operation is gone. Your men are either in custody or they've decided to work for other people. The only thing left is you." Min-jae stood up slowly, his shoulder pulling tight with pain but his face showing nothing. "You came into this house looking for power. Looking for information that would make you untouchable. But you made a mistake. You didn't understand who you were threatening." He walked to the doorway where Salome stood, watching everything with the calm expression of someone who had predicted this moment weeks ago. "This woman," Min-jae said, "has been the center of this city's power structure for 40 years. She doesn't need a ledger to be dangerous. The ledger is just paper. She is something else entirely." Salome stepped forward. She looked at Choi Dong-hyun with eyes that held no anger, just absolute certainty. "My husband understood something that most people never learn," Salome said. "Power isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about understanding the rules of the game better than everyone else. It's about knowing that sometimes the most dangerous move is being kind to a hungry boy." She looked at Min-jae, and making sure he remembers it. Choi Dong-hyun slumped in his chair. He understood now. He had never been in control. Even when he thought he was threatening Salome, he'd been walking into a trap. Every step had been predicted. Every move had been accounted for. Lee Sang-ho stepped forward and pulled Choi to his feet. "The police are outside. They're ready for pickup." As they walked Choi toward the door, he turned back to Min-jae. "You think you're different from me? You think buying a bank and forgiving a debt makes you a hero?" Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He looked at Patricia, who stood at the top of the basement stairs in her pink dress, watching everything. Watching him. "No," Min-jae said finally. "I'm not different from you. I'm just better at the game. And more importantly, I remember who I was before I became good at it." Choi was taken away. The police cars that had been waiting quietly on the street drove off into the night, carrying the vulture to a courthouse where judges and lawyers would determine his fate. But it didn't matter anymore. The real judgment had already been made. Min-jae walked to the window and watched the taillights disappear. "What happens now?" Patricia asked from the stairs. Min-jae turned to look at her. At Salome. At the house that was now technically his, though they both knew that didn't mean anything. Some things couldn't be owned. Some things could only be protected. "Now," Salome said, answering for him, "we eat dinner together. All three of us. Like family." She walked to the kitchen and began pulling out ingredients. There was rice in the pantry. Vegetables in the refrigerator. The small, ordinary things that made a meal. That made a home. Patricia came down the stairs and took Salami's hand. Min-jae stood in the doorway, watching them, and he understood something fundamental about himself. The debt wasn't paid yet. It never would be. And that was okay. The rice was warm and perfectly cooked. Salome had added ginger and sesame oil, the way she used to make it for a hungry boy 40 years ago. The vegetables were cut into small, careful pieces. The soup steamed in 3 bowls arranged around a table that had held 40 years of her life. Birthday cakes, funeral dinners, the ordinary moments that built a life into something that meant something. Min-jae sat at the table with his arm carefully positioned so the bandage on his shoulder didn't pull. Lee Sang-ho and 3 other guards stood outside the house, watching the street. Not threatening, just watching. The way guards always watched. The way people watched over things they wanted to keep safe. Patricia sat across from him, her pink dress now stained with basement dust and dried tears that had long since dried. But she was smiling, small and careful, like she was still getting used to the idea that smiling was allowed. Eat, Salome commanded, not unkindly. It was the command of someone who understood that food was more than nutrition. It was care. It was the physical form of love. Min-jae lifted the spoon to his mouth. The soup was exactly as he remembered it. Exactly. Like his taste buds had been holding onto the memory of this flavor for 4 decades, waiting for the moment when he could taste it again. His eyes closed for just a moment. Patricia watched him with the careful observation of an 8-year-old scientist. She was studying him, cataloging his reactions, understanding something about the world through watching a dangerous man eat her grandmother's soup. "Your tattoos are broken," Patricia announced suddenly. Min-jae looked at her. Salome smiled into her own bowl, but didn't say anything. "Broken?" Min-jae repeated. "Look," Patricia said, pointing at his arm with her spoon. "You have all these lines and pictures, but they're all dark. All scary. Like broken things." Min-jae looked at his tattoos. The intricate designs that covered his shoulders and arms. Dragons. Names of people he'd lost. Symbols of the organization he'd built. Each one a scar made permanent on his skin. "I have something that can fix them," Patricia said, and before anyone could respond, she was gone. Down to the basement. Up the stairs. Back to the table with a small plastic bag of stickers. They were pink. Bright, almost neon pink. Some were stars. Some were hearts. Some were cartoon characters with enormous eyes and smiling mouths. The kind of stickers an 8-year-old girl would have in her bag while waiting in a basement for rescue. "What are you doing?" Min-jae asked. "Fixing them," Patricia said very seriously. "Broken things need fixing." Before he could stop her, she peeled off a star sticker and pressed it carefully onto his shoulder, right over one of his darkest tattoos. Then a heart sticker. Then a flower. She worked methodically, decorating his arm like she was an artist, and his skin was a canvas that desperately needed beauty. Salome watched, and something that might have been the closest thing to laughter in 40 years crossed her face. "You're making me ridiculous," Min-jae said, but he wasn't moving his arm away. "You were already ridiculous," Patricia replied, concentrating hard on positioning a particularly stubborn unicorn sticker. "Now you're ridiculous and fixed." By the time Patricia finished, Min-jae's right arm looked like a child's craft project had exploded across a dangerous man's skin. Stars and hearts and flowers and cartoon characters covered his tattoos. The symbols of violence transformed into symbols of something else. Something that didn't have a name in the language of the street. He looked at his arm, and something inside him broke open. Not in a way that hurt. In a way that felt like breathing after holding your breath for 40 years. "It's beautiful," Salome said quietly. "It's ridiculous," Min-jae said, but he was smiling. Small smile. Careful smile. But real. They ate dinner together. The 3 of them. The old woman who had fed a hungry boy decades ago. The boy who had become a man who bought debt and commanded empires. The girl in the pink dress who had used a flashlight as a weapon and pink stickers as medicine. Outside, the guards stood watch over a quiet suburban street where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But it had. And then something good had happened after. Something that balanced the scales in a way that violence never could. Patricia fell asleep against Salami's shoulder around 9 o'clock. Her head drooped, her eyes closed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her. Salome carried her upstairs to a bedroom that smelled like lavender and old quilts. Min-jae sat alone at the table for a moment, looking at his decorated arm. The pink stickers caught the light of the kitchen lamp. Ridiculous. Beautiful. Real. You're going to stay, Salome said when she came back downstairs. Not a question. I can't, Min-jae said, but his voice had no weight behind it. You will, Salome said simply. You'll stay for dinner tomorrow. And the day after. And you'll help me with the garden in spring. And you'll teach Patricia things about the world that I can't teach her. And slowly, you'll remember that you were human before you became what you became. Min-jae looked at his arm, at the pink stickers covering the darkness. I remember now, he said quietly. Salome took his good hand and squeezed it. Good. Then the debt is starting to be paid. Outside, the guard stood watch. Inside, a man sat at a table with pink stickers on his arm, and for the first time in 40 years, he wasn't cold. For the first time in 40 years, he was home.